Welcome to the session 3 of China and the two Koreas. I am Shin Jong-sung, Director of the Center for Chinese Studies of the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. I'm much privileged to work as the moderator of this session, for which I much appreciate Asan Institute. China has just finished the 18th Communist Party Congress to select the new leadership led by Xi Jinping, and President Obama was re-elected last month as well. South Korea's presidential election is scheduled next week. So foreign policies of these new leaders, together with the North Korea Kim Jong-un's, may affect the situation in the Korean Peninsula and the relations between China and two Koreas in the years to come. Therefore, I believe it is very much timely to discuss here on these things under the title of the China and the two Koreas. First of all, I wish to introduce to you the three distinguished presenters of these sessions. Just next to me, Dr. Chung Jung-woo. He is the former Korean ambassador to China and now the professor of the Donghua University in Busan. And next to him, Dr. Zhu Feng. He's the professor of the School of the International Relations of the Peking University. And then next to him, Mr. Scott Snyder. He's a senior fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations, United States. And finally, actually, Dr. Andrei Lankov is supposed to join us, but he's on his way because of the heavy traffic in downtown Seoul. So please, I'd like to ask your understanding for this matter. He will join later on. We have to cover this subject in only 1 hour and 15 minutes, and we have 4 presentations. So I'd like to organize the discussion as follows. First, I will request 4 distinguished scholars to make their initial presentations from the different perspectives for about 5 to 7 minutes, respectively. And then, having done this, each of 4 presenters would be given a chance to make a question or a comment to others to be met with the relevant answers. Then I wish to open the floor. And the audience may make question and answer sessions. Having said that, let me ask Professor Zhu Feng to present his view on Chinese foreign policy toward the two Koreas under the Xi Jinping for about 5 to 7 minutes. Please.
Okay, so thanks, Mr. Ambassador. So it's a great honor for me coming, joining you for this great event. I see a lot of my old friends. So I will very briefly get through some sort of the key points I want to share with you here. First, I think the Chinese new leadership truly now is showing up. And probably it's still too early to say what sort of leadership, what sort of style of the policy they also will be at work. But basically, for the time being, I think a couple of the key characters I can easily figure that out from this generation of Chinese leadership. First, I think that Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang center the Chinese new leadership will be learning leaders in China, because their generation just got into the university after the Cultural Revolution. So for that a very key moment of their grow up, their career development, I think all the Chinese are very hungry for learning and getting the China better. So then I think such a learning tradition probably is some sort of leading figure we can easily just find out if they can just continue to redirect country to some sort of better future. So learning leader, I think is quite necessary. So Xi and Li, you also know they have the PhD degree, and they also very more specifically was worked at the Chinese local levels. They should know how today's China's situation, how tougher China's situation is. But if they can project themselves with such a big, learning format, I think they can inject something brand new into the China. Then second, I think that they are also very pragmatic Chinese leadership. So for example, so this morning session we see a lot of debate or discussion about how Xi Jinping is low profile and very good at just managing relations, fabricating some sort of good, relationship with his colleagues. So for that point, I think he will be a better balancer among the competing thoughts, competing factions, and even competing, the camps on how to look at the Chinese foreign policy and the domestic policy. So if Xi, just as I said, will present his such a leading character, he will be a better balancer. I think it's a big fortune. For example, North Korea's issue. So my colleague Chen Jianchun also mentioned the balanced approach between the North and the South. But the problem is, in one way, the balance could made. So according to the Chinese view, the balance is always there. But today, we have to just reshape some sort of new equation of balance. I mean, we needed to decisively lean into the South and pushing for some sort of, I think, a coordinated approach to any unpredictable, situation about the North Korea. The third character, I have to say, it is a very, very more humanly Chinese leader. If we look at the Xi Jinping's tour to the United States last February, he left a very deep impression. He was a relaxed Chinese leader. He always loved to smile. So his Chinese leader always being ready to offer his smiling face. You will find it's a little bit strange. Everybody can smile. Why the Chinese leader, if he can smile, will be some sort of virtue. The reason is simple. Chinese political system is not open democratic system. So leaders they do not need to some sort of such campaign in public and calling the people with their rhetoric, with their thought, with their face. They're usually selected. So Chinese leaders, I don't think they are some sort of freak, but they are less experienced in some sort of such a publicized communication skills. But if Xi Jinping could be that way, smiling and relaxed, I think he will represent some sort of a new sort of Chinese leader, which will be more humanly. So look at the most of Chinese leaders, they usually just show up with a poke face. It's their style. But now the Xi smiling frequently, so then I think it's completely new style, which will not be as big as a Kangnam style, but will be Xi's style. Third, fourth, I think the Chinese new leadership will be, of course, very, very nationalistic leaders. I think for Xi, there are two kinds of audiences. One is international, another one is domestic. So he will pay more attention to domestic audience rather than international audience. It's not just has a lot to do about his some sort of ruling legitimacy, his sort of a power base. It's about some sort of the conceivable conviction of that generation of Chinese leaders. They consider they're doing a lot of better things to get China, not just contributing to the people, our people, but also now to the world. So they're also very convinced. So whatever they are doing, the China is good heart, is good will, also will present some sort of big opportunity for the world as well. So then, yes, we heard a lot of criticism for the Chinese leaders and the Chinese current political dynamics. But for this generation Chinese leader, they're more confident, not just about some sort of their sound policy, performance, but about they can say ultimately the China's development is a big push for the world peace, stability, and prosperity. So conceivably, that sort of view should always just occur to their mind. So let me come to my last point. So what the new leadership will do to get the relations better with the Korean Peninsula. First, I think the next year will be a watershed moment. We have a new leadership, not just in China, but also in I think the South Korean and the second term of Obama administration, then the new administration at Tokyo. So if such a new leadership could just, how to say, very realistically and also very, very envisionally, just to develop some sort of new framework to boost their transaction and get their concern well received on either side. I think that will be a good moment for the region to just restructure our power relations. So far, I think I can't agree more with Professor Rosman. If we continue mishandle, then the region probably will be just sliding into the new Cold War's predicament. The second, I think if the Chinese leaders will prove to be more humility, I think his approach to the Korean Peninsula must be more productive, because there is a very contending concern to the Korean North Korea issue. One is nuclear, another is humanitarian disasters. I have to tell you, China should also address the two concerns squarely and more decisively. So not just the North Korea's nuclear issue. North Korea's issue is not just presented as some sort of a strategic, pressing, but we also just face up to the humanitarian deterioration in North. If the Chinese leader could have just make such a two concerns combined seriously, that would be great improvement and even adjustment to the Chinese policy of North Korea. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Chiu. Due to the time constraint, I don't want to sum up what you said. Then I'd like to request Ambassador Chang to present his perspective on the Korea's relations with China after the Korean presidential election on December 19 for up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Shen. I was told for this preliminary remark to stick to the coming China-South Korea relations under the new South Korean presidency. With only 8 days to go, we still do not know which way the election will go. Any effort to try to predict the outcome of the election this time is more riskier than in any other time in the history of Korean presidential election. But fortunately, we do have only two major presidential candidates, and the positions taken by these two candidates, Park Geun-hye and Moon Jae-in, on the issue of China-South Korean relations, agree more than disagree. So that will leave the burden of trying to predict the South Korean relations with Beijing under the new administration. Both candidates seem to agree on the importance of the bilateral ties, and also they agree the continuing growth of bilateral ties, particularly in the area of trade and investment, crucial for South Korea. Indeed, I believe the two candidates agree that the number one or number two policy priority for the administration will be the improvement of Sino-South Korean relations. That's a very general statement, and we do not have anything specific to go over that general statement. Perhaps one can think of the personal feelings of these two candidates toward China, for instance. Taking Park Geun-hye, the candidate for Saenuri Party, she has been known for a long time for a long association with China. And she made many trips to China, including the one she did about 4 years ago, just when this present government by President Lee Myung-bak started in February of 2008, when she was sent by President-elect to Beijing as presidential special envoy to convey goodwill. And during her stay in Beijing, I believe she met many Chinese leaders, including President Hu Jintao. She often made remarks during the campaign and in the past before the campaign, very warm feeling, expressing very warm feelings about China. She also, I think, speaks some Chinese. I saw her on television trying to speak some Chinese. I think she taught herself, but as far as I could say, her Chinese was quite good, you see. And she will be the first president, if elected, who can speak Chinese in the history of South Korea. For Moon Jae-in, you know, he was the chief of staff to President Roh Moo-hyun, whose government was known for its very favorable policy, view of China and China's role in the region and China-South Korean relations. Many who served in the Roh Moo-hyun government, we all know, had a view which could be described as critical of the United States' role in the region and also quite favorable, liberal, quote-unquote, of China's role in the region. Now, we don't have time, and I will go into a few substantive points which I wish could be picked up in the course of discussion. There are many issues, I believe, bilateral and multilateral, that should be considered in assessing the China-South Korean relations under new South Korean government. There are many bilateral issues like history issues, the overlapping claims of exclusive economic zone, you know what that means, and many others. Also, there are many multilateral issues involving third parties and fourth parties, including China-U.S. relations. We talked a lot about this China-U.S. relations, Japan-North Korea relations, and of course, North Korea-U.S. relations. But I want to point out two issue areas, which I think are mainly multilateral than bilateral. The first one is the relations between Beijing and Pyongyang. My friend Chu Fong dealt with this issue a lot, and earlier session in this room also talked about China-U.S. relations in the context of resolving North Korea nuclear issue. My sense is that the Xi Jinping leadership will focus on domestic issues, at least for the first 5 years, the first half of Xi Jinping leadership, which will be for 10 years. And for this requirement of focusing on domestic economic development and the political stability, China would not attempt any drastic change in its policy toward North Korea. China will continue to do what it has been doing in the past 5 or 10 years. Also, it is not individual leaders who make decision Chinese policy of Chinese decision on North Korea. It is the party itself. And Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang has been with the fourth generation leadership in the past 5 years already. So we do not expect, and I do not expect, any drastic change in the immediate future and China's policy toward North Korea. Having said that, I want to point out a few interesting observations. Chief Fang again mentioned about Xi Jinping, how pragmatic, how non-ideological he is. I want to add, or further than that, Xi Jinping will be very internationalist, very much an internationalist, much more than Hu Jintao was. Hu Jintao was not internationalist. Xi was, he visited the United States when he was not so senior leader in China, and he has many friends in the Western countries, including those in the United States. Interestingly, Xi Jinping's father, Xi Jinping, was chief of staff to Peng Dekai, who was commander-in-chief of Chinese volunteer armies during the Korean War. I do not know what that father's experience have on Xi's perception on the issues of Korean Peninsula. Maybe it will be too far-fetched. But I do believe that Xi has better understanding of Korea than Hu Jintao was. And Xi Jinping served in Fujian province all his life for 17 years before he went to Zhejiang and then on to Shanghai and then finally to Beijing. So he served in China, in an area where reform and open policy most flourished. So he has a very strong desire, perhaps, to see, if I may say, those Korea as much as possible to embark on a path of reform and open door. That will be one thing interesting to watch. The second point I want to make is another person in the new seven-member Politburo Standing Committee. This is Zhang, right? Right?
It is.
Right. And as you know, he will be the chairman of the Standing Committee of National People's Congress. He carries with him very interesting background. He was born and raised up and studied in Yeonbyeon, Korean ethnic minority area for a long time before he went to Pyongyang to study at Kim Il-sung University for 2 years, where he earned his bachelor's degree in economics. You see. And after he came back, he also served in area, Jirin province and Yeonbyeon in particular, where he had a lot of experiences with North Korean and Korean affairs. Actually, he will be the first one in the Politburo, much less in the Standing Committee of the Politburo in Chinese leadership, who command excellent Korean. Not only language, but also he command very good knowledge, practical knowledge of North Korea. Combined with his career in Guangdong province as party chief, where he spent many, many years, and in other areas where reform and open policy was quite successful. I do believe Xi and Zhang Dezhang will try to see, and during their terms in the leadership, North Korea, to do something on North Korea. The second relationship is North-South Korean, inter-Korean relations. So we all know that during the last 5-year period under President Lee Myung-bak, inter-Korean relations were very bad. No contact, no dialogue, and we know the military tension rising over the issue of Cheonan ship sinking and Yeonpyeong Island shelling, which was very sad and tragic, where civilians as well as military personnel lost their lives, you see. China did not try to help South Korean government in trying to push pressure on North Korea, try to persuade North Korea to take some responsibility over the incident. And many South Koreans seeing the relations between Beijing and Seoul depicted as strategic cooperative partnership were very chagrined. Now, whoever wins the election in 8 days from today, I think it will be reasonable to expect that under new leadership, whoever the president will be, inter-Korea relations will experience subtle changes. Two candidates already claimed that they would do something different from what this present government has been doing in inter-Korea relations. I do not wish to say that under the new government, from February next year on, there will be drastic change in inter-Korea relations. That should not be expected, but still the climate for better inter-Korea relations be there, and initiatives from Seoul will certainly come forward. Now, we talked about earlier in the previous session on North Korea nuclear issue. Who was it? Someone said the lady from Carnegie Endowment said that there were three goals for Chinese government over North Korea, which is stability, peace first, second, survival of North Korean regime, and third, denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. I do agree with this. I worked in the government during the first nuclear crisis, and although the situation is somewhat different now than it was in the early 1990s, I do believe that North Korean national goal was under Kim Jong-il and is under Kim Jong-un, these three: survival, and only after survival is guaranteed, then North Korea we finally agree to some measure of denuclearization. Of course, it will involve a lot of negotiation and shocks. But anyhow, what I'm saying is that unless there is improvement in inter-Korea relations, the relations between Beijing and Seoul may not be expected to make any step, to take any step, significant step forward. You see, the past 5 years experience tell us that unless inter-Korea relations improves, this will act as an impediment on Seoul-Beijing relationship. Concluding, I want to point out again that in the long sense, and a little bit idealistic perhaps statement, but I want to make this nonetheless because I wanted to make my preliminary remarks on an optimistic note, that the best option for us, for Beijing, for Washington, for Tokyo, and all of us, is to see in North Korea under the third generation ruler of Kim Jong-un, giving up as much as possible the policy of military first in exchange for economy first policy. That could be reform and open door policy of some sort. But unless this policy change in North Korea takes place, inter-Korea relations in a fundamental sense can reach nowhere. And that will affect Beijing-Seoul relations. And with the new leadership in Beijing and Pyongyang and South Korea in 8 days, we have a very good chance, I may say, historic window of opportunity to work together for this optimistic goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed, Ambassador Chung, and your great presentation it is. And I'd like to ask Mr. Snyder to give his view on the U.S. policy of rebalancing Asia and its possible implications to China and the Korean Peninsula for about 5 to 7 minutes. Please.
Okay, well, thank you, Ambassador Shim. I am going to try to make 5 points in 5 minutes. My first point is that I believe that the U.S. rebalancing strategy was overdue. In fact, it was 10 years late. I think it was pretty clear that the U.S. government was moving in that direction. If you go back and look at the 2001 Quadrennial Defense Review, 9/11 interrupted the situation. But essentially, it wouldn't have been called rebalancing at that time, but that was essentially, I think, where the U.S. was going. And so it's interesting to ask the question, 10 years later, maybe one of the challenges is whether or not that sort of approach can be as much of a shaping policy as it might have been if it had been implemented 10 years earlier. And this brings me to another aspect of rebalancing, and that is that I think there's a real challenge in terms of perceptions of rebalancing. In the U.S., it's very much seen as a reaction to Chinese assertiveness, whereas I think in China it's viewed as an action. This is relevant because if it's a reaction, it's hard to say that it's much of a strategy. And I think that raises some interesting questions for the future. My second point is that rebalancing, I think, does carry with it some implicit expectations about South Korea. Mm-hmm. And one of them is that South Korea can work with other allies in the region. So that's relevant, I think, for the Japan-Korea relationship. It's also, I think, suggests that South Korea is expecting, or the United States is expecting allies like South Korea to be more active in a regional context beyond the peninsula. We've seen what South Korea can do on the global stage with international security contributions out of area. But I think one interesting challenge for South Korea going forward is going to be what can South Korea do in the security field to help promote more effective cooperation in a regional context. My third point is really related to South Korea-China relations and my view of rebalancing. And I don't think that a more robust South Korean relationship with China contradicts a U.S. rebalancing strategy at all. Because U.S. rebalancing strategy involves intensive high-level engagement with China. That's going on through the strategic and economic dialogues and through a whole host of other dialogue arrangements that show that the United States is intensively trying to engage China on a very long agenda of issues. And so there's every reason why I think that the United States should want to see South Korea engaging in a similar robust fashion with China. And so I don't think that there is a problem that rebalancing strategy creates for South Korea-China relations. The fourth point that I want to make is that I don't see U.S.-China cooperation on the Korean Peninsula as needing to be inhibited by rebalancing in any particular way. In fact, so far as I can see, really, China hasn't made that link between North Korea-related issues and the broader rebalancing strategy. At least that's been my experience when I've had an opportunity to discuss these issues in China. In fact, I think that I could make a case that cooperation on the Korean Peninsula may become more important in the context of rebalancing and in the context of the emerging issue set that we face on security issues in the U.S.-China relationship. And what I mean by that is that as the South China Sea and the East China Sea become more difficult issues in U.S.-China security cooperation, it may be that in Washington and Beijing, North Korea actually becomes the easier issue to cooperate on. And so that could be a positive. And I think another aspect of that that makes the Korean Peninsula easier than some of the other issues is that basically, in the East China Sea and in the South China Sea, generally speaking, the U.S. is concerned about the U.S. taking, or the U.S. is concerned about China playing a role that would change the status quo. But in Northeast Asia, with North Korea, China is trying to preserve the status quo. And so I think that dynamic actually might, interestingly enough, make the possibility of cooperation on North Korea easier for China. And then the last point I'd like to make is that I think that the United States, and this builds on the last session to a certain degree, should not be depending on China to represent its interests to North Korea. And we need to have, the United States government needs to have direct engagement with North Korea in close concert with what I think we're all anticipating is an improvement in the atmosphere for inter-Korean relations. And so really that makes, stable inter-Korean relations is the first building block that really has to be put into place for the U.S. to be able to engage more effectively with North Korea, and I think, in turn, actually for China, hopefully to play a role vis-a-vis managing stability on the Korean Peninsula that is more aligned with both the policies of the U.S. and South Korea. So let me stop there. It looks like I've talked long enough for our fourth colleague to arrive.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Snyder. And finally, we have Dr. Andrei Lankov of the Kookmin University in Seoul. I'm very happy to have you here. And I'd like to request Professor Lankov to give his view on Kim Jong-un's North Korea and its relations with China and South Korea. I think it would be more useful if you could include whether North Korea will continue to deepen its dependency on China or take reform and open up policies and try to improve the relations with the United States and Korea in the future. Please.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting, and sorry for the mess. I'm late because I just made a mistake with my own timetable. Having said that, talking about future policy of Kim Jong-un, I'm slightly pessimistic. I believe that, unfortunately, policy of Kim Jong-il was quite rational if judged from the point of view of North Korean government. So, in July and August in North Korea, we saw some serious attempts, which appeared to be serious attempts at reforms, but these attempts were suddenly halted. And honestly, I was surprised when I saw attempts to reform the country, and I'm not surprised when I saw that it suddenly came to a standstill. From North Korean point of view, from the point of view of the North Korean elite, the best policy is to continue the current line of avoiding reforms. In a divided country like North Korea, reforms, unlike China, it's not China, it's not South, it's not Vietnam, because there is no South China. Korea is a divided country. If they try to reform themselves, they will become dangerously unstable. It was well understood by Kim Jong-il, and we sort of know it because of, well, recently published book by his eldest son. And it seems to be understood, if not by Kim Jong-un, but at least by his advisors. So we probably should expect continuation of the same policy. No reforms, no liberalization. It makes perfect sense, but it's very bad for economy. And they are stuck with an efficient economy, which means they will do everything possible to squeeze outside aid. And right now, the major provider, for all practical purposes, the sole provider of aid which is available for North Korea is China. However, it doesn't mean that they are really dependent of China. And if we look at history of North Korean foreign policy, they have always been very, very careful in not laying all eggs in one basket. They always would prefer to have few sponsors, preferably sponsors who strongly disliked one another, who hated one another. So sponsors could be manipulated. Their rivalries could be used. This is what North Korea did in the 60s and 70s, when they used rivalry between the Soviet Union and China. And they were quite successful to some extent for last 15 years when they were playing on contradictions between South Korea, Japan, and United States, and milking all participants, and of course China, milking all participants, getting aid without many conditions. Now they're getting aid from China, they are not happy about it. So I would expect them to try to do something to improve relations with the United States. Because, very simple, because they need American aid. They need American money. And they need this money to play America against China. To tell Chinese that if they are too pushy, they will go to Washington. Pretty much like they did in the 60s and 70s with Soviet Union and China. So they need an alternative source of funding, preferably United States, because, well, and South Korea, they hope for some changes here after the coming elections. And so they will probably try to reach the United States. And because United States are now not exactly in talking mood, because the current mood in Washington is essentially no negotiating with North Korea, which I believe to be a mistake, but it's a current mood. So probably they will try to do something dramatic, something which other people would describe as provocations, like, say, a nuclear test and missile launch. Missile launch maybe is not efficient as long as they are not successful. But if Americans are not just, listen to sweet talk, well, probably there will be some kind of actions just to remind that North Korea is there and it's dangerous and should not be forgotten. And the major reason why they are likely to do so is exactly China. They are way too much dependent on China, and they don't want it because they are afraid that this dependency of China will eventually give Chinese government leverage over North Korean policy. I believe China now doesn't have much leverage of North Korean policy, but God knows what will happen. So they would prefer to get United States back. Talking about China, unfortunately also I don't expect serious changes in the Chinese policy. Because, frankly, both policy of North Korea and policy of China over the last decade have been rational, pragmatic, Machiavellian, like probably any good policy should be. China sees its interests, which are first, to keep stability in North Korea, second, to keep Korean Peninsula divided, third, to protect economic interests of China. And if it means that China is willing to support North Korea, it's not that China likes North Korea or that China is happy about North Korean nuclear and missile developments. China is not happy, of course. But they will never hit too hard because the result will be instability. And instability is a greater fear than nuclear developments. China essentially faces a choice between stable but nuclear and sometimes, well, troublesome and unruly, if you like, North Korea, and North Korea maybe non-nuclear, maybe reforming but unstable. And the second option, non-nuclear but reforming but unstable North Korea, is a greater evil for China. China needs stability. China needs stability. China is a status quo power, and it has to be. And once again, it's not a miscalculation, and it's not even egoistic interest of the Chinese elite. From the point of view of China as a state, as a society, it's a rational, if slightly cynical policy, but honestly, it's, well, many cases good policy is rational and cynical at the same time. So I don't expect the new Chinese leadership to disband this policy. And if somebody in Washington, say, has expectations that they can talk, if you like, Americans in changing their attitude to North Korea, or push Americans in changing their attitude to North Korea, it's not going to happen. Chinese policy on North Korea is essentially of, keeping North Korea afloat, without maybe giving too much money, but keeping them afloat, preventing a major disaster, and at the same time trying to influence them quietly but without much success. And again, China would like to see them non-nuclear, but as long as doesn't create threats for stability. And stability for China is the top priority. Division of Korea is the second important priority, significantly less important. They can compromise, they can accept unified Korea if it's stable. Stability is number one. Division is number two, denuclearization is number three, and honestly I think it's a very good, it's very rational assessment of the situation, and no efforts of American or South Korean diplomacy is going to change it, frankly. Well, I think it's all.
Okay, Thank you very much, Dr. Lanko, for your informative presentation. As I said already, now I wish to give all of you a chance to make a question or the comment among viewers. But right now the time is left only 30 minutes. Therefore, I'd like to ask you to make your comment or question as short as possible. Please, from the Ambassador Chong, you have the floor.
There are so many questions I'd like to raise my fellow panelists. I want to raise one question to Xiaofeng and then the other to Professor Lanko, if you don't mind. To Xiaofeng, I'd like to ask you explained this in your presentation, but what do you think there will be substantive changes, significant changes in Chinese policy under Xi Jinping era toward North Korea, say vis-a-vis denuclearization, and more importantly, as I said in my own presentation, will the Xi Jinping leadership push North Korea gradually to go for more economic, more market-oriented economic policy, giving up the military-first policy, and eventually reform and open policy. That's the question I want to address to you. To Mr. Lanko, you didn't say this in your presentation, but my question is, since you are North Korean, the North Korean expert, what is your assessment of the current political situation in North Korea? Is Kim Jong-un very much in control of the country, or as a report said that these days is still very uncertain? That's my question.
Yes. And Professor Jupong,
Okay.
you can answer to the Ambassador Chong's question, and then you have the right to make a comment or a question.
Okay. First of all, thanks, Ambassador Chen. I think it's a good question. Then, first of all, I'd like to just responding slightly to Andrew Lankoff's assumption about Chinese strategic goal of the North Korea. So, I have to say, China's policy of North Korea has been a big controversy. But the reason of the Chinese controversy behind the North Korea's policy is not how much it's well prepared or well planned. Actually, the leading reason behind such a controversy is China's lingering indecision and indecisiveness or hesitation. So I don't think, for example, Andrew Chile is a great North Korea's expert, but China could be able to keep the two Koreas separate. It's outreach. It's also unachievable. So if the China thinks that way, I think the Chinese leadership should be just learning a lot more things. So yes, I have to tell you, no single policy issue in my country which divides the Chinese peoples more than the North Korea's issue. But the problem is, just like I say, we should have adequate attribution. So if the China set the goal of the two Koreans policy on perpetuating separation or daunting some sort of distance in between the two Koreans, my view is that it's harder to achieve. And it's also very, very, harder to reach. So then that's why I think we should just precisely and very explicitly figure out what's the key reason behind the Chinese policy controversy of North Korea. Then Ambassador Chen's question is how likely China's policy change under the Xi and the Lee's administration. First of all, I have to say I see more continuity than change in short run. But in the media run, I think a massive change. For example, just like I say, we have to very sophisticatedly and spontaneously work on a more nuanced policy of North Korea with three balance. One is between the two Koreans, the balance between two Koreans. Second is between, just like I say, nuclear or security concern and humanitarian disaster, which now is spreading out in Korea. So I hope that Xi and Li really could face up to this reality and keep the two things meeting, because we can't blind to such spreading sufferings and starvation. Otherwise, I think that China's great power imagery must be at the stakes. The third balance, I think, is very important. We should just build up a very sophisticated balance of our policy of the North Korea on the decisive addressing of the North Korea threat and some sort of new push for just a reconstruction of a regional security order. So Scott mentioned, for example, the rebalancing policy. Yes, rebalancing policy caused a lot of crippling effects in the Chinese domestic debate. Some people say, okay, so this rebalancing push should vindicate the Chinese hardline policy behind the North Korea, vis-a-vis U.S. and the South. But I don't think such people are a bigger portion. But for me, I think the Chinese very effective way to low down some sort of the impact of the rebalancing is we should be more, we should be wiser, we should be smarter in addressing the North Korea's issues. It's obvious. On the other hand, I also see, for example, uncertainty with regard to North Korea is also arising. So China has to be very necessarily prepared for some sort of unpredictable prospect of North Korea. So for this point, I think we should also just reset our, such a coordination with the key players, U.S., Korean, and Japan, as well as Russia. So then, from all such a, the scenario-based, foreseeing, we have to say, if the China's government continue very broadly and very stably, just see we should stay the same, that would be unbelievably, I think, stupid. Fortunately, China's leader usually is aesthetic, rigorous, but they are really not stupid. Believe me. Okay. Yeah.
Right. And then Mr. Snyder.
Yeah, I'm actually just going to make one comment because I think we need to get to questions. And that comment is simply that, the one aspect on the Korean Peninsula that I worry about regarding rebalancing is that it's absolutely necessary, I think, for China to view its relationships on the Korean Peninsula on their own terms, rather than looking at the peninsula as through the lens of the strategic relationship with the United States. Mm-hmm. And so in that respect, I believe that it's really essential for China to get to that point for us to be able to make some other kinds of progress.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then finally, Professor Langkok, do you have any comments or questions?
Yeah, so question of Ambassador Chon. Frankly, nobody knows. I don't know. Nobody knows who is now in control of North Korea. I can speculate, and well, what we have seen, a dramatic change in the military leadership. Of the 4 top military commanders who were present at Kim Jong-il's funeral last year, none has survived politically, and 3 have obviously been purged completely and probably are in a serious problem. At the same time, we see that civilian bureaucrats are doing just fine. And we don't see new faces because Kim Jong-un is young. So people who can be seen as his friends or lieutenants, they have to be young as well. And we don't see young faces. So well, as a kind of working explanation is we see a struggle between civilian bureaucrats in the military top brass, civilian bureaucrats are winning. Maybe they are somehow incorporating Kim Jong-un in their ranks. But whether it's Kim Jong-un is in control of civilian bureaucrats, or whether it's Chan Son-taek, I would not dare to say. For myself, I would say probably he is not in full control, but you never know. Second, but the fact whether he is in control or not, it doesn't really mean that even if he is not in control, which is likely, it doesn't mean that the country is unstable. Because the North Korean bureaucrats, the North Korean top elite, they understand they have to hang together, otherwise they would surely be hanged separately. They understand that because of their very dangerous and unstable political situation, they have to keep together. So it's unlikely that any group of North Korean political leadership will challenge Kim Jong-un openly. He has sort of royal blood. He is a person who has a measure of legitimacy, and even if he is not really in full control, he is likely to stay as a kind of a figurehead at least, and probably sooner or later he will acquire enough power. But once again, everything which is related to the domestic policy of North Korea is necessarily highly speculative, and I will be very careful about when talking about it. What is clear now is that the situation seems to be politically stable, that government is in control of situation, maybe more in control than a few years ago. So, well, once again, a revolution or collapse or whichever can happen at any moment, but if you're asking whether I see any signs, not much. So situation seems to be stable in spite of fighting on top between obviously military and civilian bureaucrats. Kim Jong-un is likely to remain for foreseeable future, and the regime seems to be stable as well. This is what I would say.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we have just 15 minutes left, and so I'd like to open the floor. But before opening the floor, I'd like to pose one question to Professor Lankov. Actually, whenever there occurs North Korean provocations, everybody looks up at China. But some of my Chinese friends used to tell me that North Korea does not necessarily trust China, nor listen to the Chinese advice. Do you think so? And
yes.
If that is the fact, then what is the reason behind it?
Why should they listen to the Chinese advice? China is a threat. China is a problem for them. China is something to be afraid, to be despised, because it's the only country which has both means and reasons to get involved in their domestic politics, as a matter of fact. In 1956, Chinese, together with Russians, sponsored a coup, which was the only serious threat to the Kim family rule over 3 generations of the Kim dynasty. And this threat was secretly sponsored by the Russians and Chinese. Why should they love China? They are using China. And they are not going to bow to pressure. And their basic experience, going back to Kim Il-sung era, is you should not make concessions on the issues related to your own political stability, to your control over country. And they believe that things related to dealing with South Korea and, of course, nuclear and missile programs are vital for their survival. And frankly, I believe it too. I believe they're absolutely right. And on these issues, they are not going to listen to anybody's advice, especially advice of China.
Thank you. And I'll take the questions from the floor, please. Please. Yes, I think he's the first, yes. And then yours.
Thank you.
Please
I'm Georg
identify
Rai
yourself,
from Russian Academy of Science, and I fully agree to Andrei Zlankov's analysis, but for one thing about that no one knows who's in charge in North Korea, it's more or less clear now. But based on this analysis, what I would like to ask the panel is, first, will the new government in South Korea, given all this information and understand that China won't change its policy much vis-a-vis North Korea, will the new government continue the efforts to undermine Chinese-North Korean relations, to pressure China, to pressure North Korea in case of provocations, which causes lots of irritation in China, and how this change in policies might affect South Korea-Chinese relations, which are pretty strained in several aspects now. And second, how China will probably see inter-Korean relations, North-South relations. What would be South Korea government position, new government position on this issue? Thank you.
And then maybe take another question, please.
Yes, Jonathan Pollock from Brookings. I actually have a partial comment and a related question. And so my comment and query is really directed at Scott Snyder. In what ways is the so-called rebalancing policy affecting, in any meaningful sense, American strategy in Northeast Asia? You can make an argument about Southeast Asia, where there is some palpable movement. I mean, I think that is the principal dimension, if you will, of a change in U.S. policy. But are there any areas that we can see with respect to Northeast Asia that seem significantly different than they were before there was such a pronouncement of what I would like to call a bumper sticker more than a strategy? My query is to Andrei Lankov. It seems to me, Andrei, that there are really two different definitions of instability. One would be instability in the North that is triggered by elite conflict. The other might be a more bottom-up instability by social forces, other sorts of stress within the system. Whether that's controllable or not, I'm not sure, but I wonder whether you would want to make a distinction at all between the two.
Okay, thank you. And I think the Mr. Snyder, would you like to reply?
Sure. I mean, there's not much direct focus in terms of rebalancing on Northeast Asia. I believe that one second-order effect of the policy is that it means that the U.S. wants to see more horizontal cooperation among allies. And with regard to the Japan-Korea relationship, I think indirectly that creates some tensions that have been, I think, highlighted amply over the course of the past few months in the context of GSOMIA, the islands, et cetera. But the other area, I think, is that rebalancing actually, it's sold in ways that creates expectations. And if something happens in North Korea, those expectations are really going to be tested, especially regarding financial commitments, I think, to rebalancing.
Yeah. Mr. Lankov, do you have something to say?
Yes. Talking about these two types of instability, yes, they are different. But I think that elite instability, visible elite instability, visible in fighting within the elite, because what we have seen over last year, some important people disappeared, but it was very quiet. But if we see signs of dramatic changes in policy line and everything, I would say that such elite instability will very soon trigger the massive instability from below. Because one of the reasons which might lead to a regime collapse is open infighting of the elite. Especially because they will have to mobilize, they will probably try to mobilize some kind of support from below, and this is very dangerous. Dangerous for the stability. Serious. So, well, I think that North Korea simply cannot survive any prolonged period of the open elite instability. Exactly because of, well, situation of the divided country and many other things. But this seems to be well understood by the North Korean decision makers and the North Korean elite. So these people are going to play safe. They are not going to rock the boat unless really pressed.
Okay, I'd like to ask the gentleman from the Russian Social Science Academy. Would you like to make your question once again?
You mean the question concerning the Chinese new government policy towards inter-Korean relations that were asked?
Okay, then I think Professor Jupong, you're the right person to answer that question.
Okay, I will be very, very, very brief. First of all, I think that if the North Korea issue could Chile very adequately and reasonably addressed, I think that would be lay out the new and a more solid ground for the Seoul and Beijing to proceed with a better relationship in coming years. I completely just hope for that. The second, I think that also will be some sort of remarkable change of geopolitical landscape in Northeast Asia. So it also maybe will facilitate, for example, solution or settlement of the cross-Taiwan relations. Then it will be a very attractive, appealing to, for example, Chinese and Japanese. For example, a unified Korean, that will be a very, very important role in any formation of a regional strategic landscape. So then I see a multilateral ramifications coming from such as some sort of a solution, not just the settlement of the North Korea's issues between Beijing and Seoul. But the most important thing is that any solution or settlement should be also through some sort of joint efforts, joint attempts, for example, of some sort of emergency engagements, Japan's participation. So then I hope, just like I say, I think Ambassador Chang also presented very clearly. So next year maybe some sort of opening of the new window of opportunity. North Korea's issue could be some sort of productive, driver behind regional efforts to get things in place, or will continue to be marred very, very badly and ominously in East China Sea issue, South China Sea issue. But anyway, I would like to see the wisdom and encouragement of the new government's each.
Okay, thank you. And, yeah.
I'm Doug Paul from the Carnegie Endowment. Two quick questions. The first is, no one has mentioned the territorial dispute between China and South Korea over Eodo. Is this not to be thought about? Is it, given what's happened elsewhere with maritime disputes, shouldn't we put it on the agenda? And secondly, for Andrei Lankov, you said that you thought that the policy of withholding assistance and interaction with North Korea was not the way to go. What is the way to go, telegraphically, if you could put it that way?
Yeah. So, Ambassador Chang, would you like to comment on Eodo?
I think my answer to your question will be only partial. I think I mentioned in my presentation when I said overlapping claim over exclusive economic zone. And to me, the issue of Eodo is not as much a territorial dispute as it is a dispute over EEZ, you see, which is very different from those existing between Tokyo and Beijing, like the island, you see, Teotao. And between China and South Korean government so far, the issue has not become a very serious pending issue. There were reports, but the two governments did not try to raise any serious claim over that small rock, you see, under sea. So I don't think the issue between China and South Korea will become as serious as those between Japan and China. Of course, China will always raise this issue as when the relation between Seoul and Beijing becomes very bad, you see. That possibility cannot be excluded. But even then, the issue, the nature of issue is quite different from the one between Japan and China, which is dispute over territorial claim.
Okay. Professor Lankov?
Well, how many hours do I have to answer your question? Say 2 minutes. Well, I would say the way to go is to develop exchanges and relations with North Korea. Why? First, pressure is not going to work. Partially because a really comprehensive sanctions regime is going to be sabotaged by China. And second, if by some miracle, and it will be a very bad miracle, China joins the efforts, it will not produce a regime collapse. Maybe it will, but not before. Another few 100,000 North Koreans will starve to death. North Korean regime is very insensitive to foreign pressures. It's designed in a way which allows the decision makers ignore the suffering of the common people. Economic pressure doesn't work. And these people, some people say they will be deprived of their luxury goods. I can assure you, if an alternative is between a lamppost and somehow surviving without Hennessy cognac, the choice is too obvious. So sanctions is way to nowhere. Unfortunately, sanctions look very tough, look very good, and it sells very well in democratic countries, unfortunately. What is the way to go? I think the best way is exchanges. Soft line, dovish line if you like. However, it should be an engagement with open eyes, without some silly ideas which are often believed by the supporters of the engagement, or sometimes they pretend to believe because they wanted to sell to the public. They say, wow, we should talk to these people, we should love these people, they are human beings, they love their families, they are humans too. Exactly because they love their families, they have to follow the policies they are following. Because they love their families and not families of farmers in distant North Korean provinces. And it's a choice. But no, it should not be an idea that, they can be somehow persuaded to emulate China. Maybe yes, highly unlikely, no. But if we have a kind of exchanges policy, more soft approach, first, it's possible to make some compromises. I don't think denuclearization of North Korea is possible, it's impossible. But it's possible to make a deal about freezing North Korean nuclear program. Not dismantling is a non-starter, but freezing. It's also quite possible if we have sort of soft dovish approach to make sure that no major provocations will happen again. There will be no more Chonan, there will be no more Yonpyeongdo, there will be probably no even more missile and launches and everything. Second. Third most important, exchanges means that North Korean public will learn about outside world. And they will clearly start comparing their life with the life of the outside world and above all, a life of South Koreans. And this will make them critical of their own system. They will demand change. And this is pressure from below, will probably push North Korean government towards reforms. If they survive, if they can start Chinese reforms and survive the experience, fine. If it leads to the regime collapse, well, it's going to be a very bumpy ride, but it's still not very bad. So it's a mounting domestic pressure for change. People should see that they are living in a very backward and a very restrictive rigid society. And how can they see it? Only by exchanges, only if they are given opportunities to learn about the world outside their borders. So in the short run, it's a way to prevent major confrontation and not to solve North Korean nuclear issue. North Korean nuclear issue is unsolvable. End of story. Never, ever. But to mitigate the problems. And in the long run, it's the only way to change North Korea and change it from within. And what is important, it will be done by the North Koreans themselves.
Okay, I think the time is up. It's about 5 o'clock, so I think it's about time to close the discussions. I believe we had a very useful and informative session, so I very much appreciate for that. Like the previous sessions, I don't have a conclusion, except that there will be the window of opportunity next year. And I truly thank all participants of this session for their constructive discussions and attentions. Now I declare the session closed. Thank you very much.
Glad that you made it. Good to see you.